Thanks so much, Melissa, for having me. And thank you for spending your Tuesday night with us. We were just talking before we started that it feels like it's already Thursday. And, a year into this pandemic, you're still interested in joining Zoom calls to learn and build community. So thank you for being here. As Melissa said, I'm Carolyn. I use she, her pronouns. And I've been working for the past 10 years in DuPage County supporting LGBTQ teens and their families. And so today, really this conversation as we go through some of these slides is recognizing that sometimes we're parenting teens in a time that's, well, all of us are parenting teens in a time that's so different from how we are raised, right? And so like, this is a topic that our kids might know more about than we do. And so this is an effort to kind of like level the playing field and talk about like, what are the words that our kids are using when they're saying LGBTQIA2S plus, like all these letters, alphabet soup, right? Like what is that? So then we can talk to our kids about that. So you might be here because your child or young people in your life that you care about identify as LGBTQ, or you just want to create a welcoming environment. But that's really what we're here to talk about today, is just like, how do we, like, what's going on with teens, what words are they using, and then like, how do we meaningfully engage with our young people so that they have a great experience with us. And so let me try and advance the slide. So just again, I work at 360 Youth Services. I also coordinate a name change mobilization for trans folks to help like change their names and update their identity documents. And I run some groups in the community to help other professionals create safe and welcoming spaces. And then I'm joined with Peggy, and I don't know if you want to introduce yourself real quick, who's going to help do some Q&A with me.
Yeah, I'm Peggy Tomchek. I'm a licensed professional counselor at Evolution Counseling in Naperville. I work with a lot of LGBTQ youth in my practice, specifically transgender folks. And we collaborate quite a bit with resources with DuPage Community Network and 360 Youth Services. In addition, our practice is part of the clinician collaborative, the gender nonconforming clinicians collaborative of Lurie Children's. So we're just here as a resource and happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. And so if you feel comfortable in the chat, if you want to, I think you can reply to everybody. So if you feel comfortable, you can say your name, what pronouns you use, how do we refer to you if we forget your name? She, her, he, him, they, them. And if you feel comfortable sharing the age of your student and what brings you here tonight, you can definitely do that in the chat. And so we can just see who's in the space. And then I'm going to keep us moving while you're doing that. And if there's, or maybe someone can, who has their camera on, can nod if you have accessibility to email or to message everyone. Okay, great. So again, this is just to help me kind of have a sense of what age of the young people that you're interested in learning more about. And so there's so much that we could talk about, and we have an hour together, and we really want to have like a dialogue and discussion and hear what questions are coming up for you. So I'm going to talk fast and get through some of these slides that I normally present to different schools and mental health providers and youth workers. So we're going to talk about terms. I'll quickly share what we're seeing in terms of trends with LGBTQ youth, and then we can get into like, what are those joys and challenges of supporting our young people. And so thanks for folks who've shared so far. We have, looks like high school aged students, your parents or guardians to high school aged youth. Great, thank you for being here. And so, what I always say for our time together, what happens here stays here, what's learned here leaves here. So I'm not going to say, oh my gosh, did you hear Peggy's child came out as, whatever letter under the spectrum, but you might say, hey, I learned that when Peggy's kid comes over, this is something that I might try and do at my house, those types of things. And please do whatever you need to feel comfortable in the space. You don't have to know all of the words. That's why we're talking. So if you want to ask a question, but you're not sure what to say, ask it in the language that you use now. And if there's other words that we can use, we'll talk about that together. So why are we having this conversation? I kind of like said that already, but LGBTQ young people exist in our families, they exist in our community. And I think it's the hope of many people that our youth are going to be able to thrive in the same way as their straight or cisgender peers. And so, so hopefully this conversation creates more welcoming homes in our area. That's what I hope we get out of it. And then I hope that you leave with like having some more education around talking with your young people. And so I think some important things when we talk about like how old can someone be to know that they're LGBTQ? And so when I say that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning, that's what that Q can stand for. How old can someone be? And I have a little typo in there, but the average age of talking about like sexual orientation we see is like between the ages of like 12 and 16 of kids coming out. And that is getting younger and younger. So like when I first started my social work career like 10 years ago, like even high schools were like, well, we don't really like we have some gay kids, but we don't really have transgender kids. And now I'm talking to elementary schools with trans youth. And so I think like our perceptions of like how old someone can be, um, 15 years ago, the average coming out age was around 21. And so it's dropped significantly. And then around gender identity, the average age of like talking about being your gender being different, we've seen in studies is like 5 years old for trans girls and 8 years old for trans boys. So it's not uncommon for us to see elementary age, junior high youth in our community who are identifying as transgender, because if you think about like how old you knew you were, like when I knew I was a girl, right? Like that happens really young. We might not always have the language for it. And I think we do. A lot of the youth in our community and in our nation have terms that we didn't have access to. So
Carol, I'll just jump in with a question real quick.
sure.
What are some of the best things to say to a teen who thinks they are on the LGBTQ plus spectrum, but are confused about what they are? We hear a lot of pressure in the world to check a box and frustration with not knowing.
Yeah. So I'm like, my first thought is like what not to say, right? I think the things that kids don't want you to say is like, well, you won't know till you're older. Like, it's just a phase. Like those are types of things. I think to me, if someone tells me like, hey, I think I might be bisexual or I might be this label, it's like the first step is like, wow, like thank you so much for trusting me with that and like telling me that. That means a lot that you feel like you can share that to me. Like, how long have you been thinking that? Or something like that might be helpful. I don't think we have to have the perfect words out of our mouth the first time. But I think like maybe the first thing I would say is thanks so much for sharing that with me.
I think creating a safe environment with trust is always a great first step.
Yeah.
I think exactly what you said is right on.
And I think what's common is that like we try on different words, like different words feel like, oh wait, you hear this word and you're like, I think that's what I am. And then and so some kids come out and then they find, as they're like exploring themselves, they might find that another word fits. And so I think that's also, what is your response when they come out to you a second time or a third time of like, well, couldn't you just be that? Or, oh, great, now another letter we got to learn, and say like, oh, that's cool that you found another term for you. Like, how did you find that? Like, what makes that word feel like it fits more like home than the previous word? So yeah, those are some things I would say. Thanks, Peggy. And then I screenshotted this. I don't know if anyone saw like last week, this was like the headline everywhere that 1 in 6 Gen Z youth are identifying, or Gen Z adults are identifying as LGBT, and the number could continue to grow. So that to me, like, so we used to say about 5 to 7% of the youth population identifies as LGBTQ. But that number is a lot higher. And so, so I think this speaks to like our world being a little bit more comfortable with some terms, feeling less like rigid between different boxes. And so that's something to recognize, that like we might have more of our kids feeling comfortable to tell us who they are and not fit like so distinctly into one box or another. And so as we talk about terms, I heard this great quote about on a webinar last year that says, you don't have to keep up, you just have to keep open, right? We're never gonna learn all the words our kids use, right? That's like the fun part of working with young people, I think, is like I get to learn all these words that they use to describe their experience and then go tell all my friends. But right, our kids, regardless of identity words or any other words, they're always teaching us new things. And that's the same thing with LGBTQ identities. And so, you know, our LGBTQ young people have lots of different dimensions of their identities. And in this case, like compared to their family, compared to you, their guardians or parents, this might be one of the first times that they have an identity that's different from yours, maybe of the same socioeconomic status, the same religion, but maybe this is the first thing that feels different, right? So that can cause some conflict, but also like taking that in of, this is a time that I can't completely relate to my young person, or I've never gone to high school during COVID and virtual, right? So there's a lot of times that we're having differences in our experiences, but this can be one distinct one. And so when we say LGBTQ, so again, those words like lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning, we lump a bunch of different spectrums into one acronym and then confuse you all. So I'm gonna like break that down a little bit. And so, so that you can kind of understand. So when I'm saying sexual orientation, I'm thinking about that in my heart. Like that's the heart of our gender unicorn example here. So that's our patterns of attraction, right? We all have a sexual orientation. So whether that's straight, gay, bisexual, asexual, pansexual, those are some of like the common ones that we hear our young people using. So pan means all. So it's the potential to experience attraction to members of all gender identities or expressions. And so that word sometimes is a little bit more inclusive than bisexual to some people. You can hear my dog in the background. So sorry about that. But so pan, and then asexual, we're seeing more youth identifying as ace or asexual, like having a lack or a low level of sexual attraction to others. So, right, we all have that. That's in our, we think about that in our hearts. And then we all have a gender identity. So that's like our deeply internal felt sense of self, of how we know ourselves to be a man, a woman, or maybe neither, or a mixture thereof, right? And that's the part that like can like be mind-boggling. What do you mean? Like you're either a boy or you're either a girl, you're either a man or either a woman, right? That's how most of us were raised. Those were the options. And this graphic here really shows that a lot of these things exist on a spectrum. The way I identify as a woman might be different than the way Peggy does, the way Melissa does, however, right? And they're not necessarily static across your lifetime. And so our gender identity, though, is different from our biological sex, or what we call our sex assigned at birth. So when the doctor holds us up, looks at us and goes, it's a girl or it's a boy, they're looking at like one component of our biological sex, but really that like, or I like to call it sex assigned at birth because they're assigning it based on one of our character traits. But our actual like sex is chromosomes, hormones, secondary sex characteristics, internal or external genitalia, like all of those things. And so when we're born, we assign everybody a sex, and then they grow up, and sometimes their gender matches that, and sometimes it doesn't. And in that case, that would be someone who's transgender, or maybe non-binary. We'll talk about what those words are. And then the last part is like our gender expression. So we see that on the unicorn as these like green dots. That's all the ways we tell the world what gender we identify as. So it's the way we wear our hair, the clothes we wear, how we present to the world. And we use people's gender expression to know when we don't know them, right? We're at the grocery store and we're saying like, excuse me, sir, or excuse me, ma'am. Or we know when we're like, oh, wait, I don't know what this person's gender is. Like they feel androgynous to me. I can't, so I'm gonna look for extra clues that, you know, to try and figure out how to say, what do I say to this person? And so again, when we look at that acronym LGBT, the L, the G, the B, those are sexual orientation words. The T, transgender, could be a gender identity word. And then Q, queer, questioning, could really kind of stand for either, depending on how people identify. So I think this is an interesting activity to like, you know, that I use sometimes with LGBTQ young people that I'm working with, because it helps me get a sense of, where they're at with their identity. And for kids in the grades that we're, parenting or teaching, they this might be a time that they're discovering these things. So where they're at may be different, at the end of middle school or high school.
Carolyn, can I jump in with a couple
Sure.
questions?
Yeah.
One is 2 to 3 year olds, is that common? I'm assuming that has to do with trans folks. Was there a statistic on one of the slides? And the other is a trans boy born a boy or a girl.
That's a great question. And so I'm going to go back for a second to that slide. So it's I wrote, it's not uncommon for folks to identify as early as 2 or 3 years old. Most transgender people, right, like I always say, like, the gender police are alive and well. Like we know, like, these are boy toys, these are girl toys, right? Even in the most, like, in the household that's like, oh, we don't do that, like it's so ingrained in our society. So it's not that there's like tons of people that are coming out as 2 to 3, but we also have seen examples of that. And like Peggy mentioned, working with Lurie Children's Hospital, they have a gender and sex development program that sees families with, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds who are expressing not just that I like boy things, but I am a boy.
Right.
And then when I say the word trans boy, I'm always referring to how someone presently identifies. So a transgender boy would be someone who was assigned female at birth and then transitioned to male. So I'm trying to think of it's hard. There's not tons of famous trans men that everybody knows, but if you think about Caitlyn Jenner, she's a trans woman or a trans girl. She was assigned male at birth and identifies as female. All right, and so let me keep us moving. So I think if we leave with nothing else, remembering everyone has a sexual orientation, everyone has a gender identity, and then like living with a teenager, like these are things that they're could be in the process of figuring out, or they could know themselves and they're trying to figure out, can I share that with you? So there's, we can send these slides out to everybody who registered, but there's lots of different words that people use to describe their sexual orientation, lots of words that people use to describe their gender identity. I always say Google with caution, but some that I want to highlight, I said the word transgender or trans a lot, and that just means you identify differently from how you were assigned at birth. Cisgender means you identify similarly to how you were assigned at birth. So for me, I'm a cisgender woman. The doctor said, congratulations, Carolyn's a girl, and I identify as a woman, right? And so cisgender people have privilege in our world, right? Or sometimes it's shortened to cis. So if you hear a kid say cis het, it's a cisgender straight person. So someone who their gender aligns with how they were assigned, and they like people of different genders. And then non-binary means like not fitting within the accepted pattern for male or female. So some people don't feel exclusively like they're a boy or a girl. So there's a question in the comments, sex and gender are different. Yes. So sex, right, really speaks to like our biological traits. Like I said, our chromosomes, our hormones, secondary sex characteristics, and gender is like our internal self of how we know ourselves to be. And that can operate differently depending on our society, right? And there's different gender roles that throughout the world that people have depending on the time and place that you're in. And so how many genders are there now? Like, that's not a question I can like that anyone knows, right? So obviously the common genders are male, like man and woman, but we also know that those words are limiting and it's not enough to describe people's experience, right? So in some ways you can argue that everyone has their own gender. So there's as many genders as there are people. But then someone's gonna go quote me and say that I said there's 9 billion genders. But I think, right, so it is a unique thing for each person. And then is it still acceptable to say straight or hetero? Yeah, it's still fine. It's fine to say straight. Yeah, straight, heterosexual. I think straight like comes off the tongue easier. So yeah, good question. And then just talking a little bit about transitioning. So transitioning, like when someone, is assigned a sex at birth and then they start identifying differently, that process is often called transitioning. So it's the various ways that people take to like live as their true authentic self. And so if someone doesn't transgender from male to female, they transition from male to female. And so and we often see that in a couple different ways, like a social transition saying, hey, I'm trans, these are my name, this is my pronouns, like this is what I need to like participate in school, like this is what I like, the haircut I want, you know. And a medical transition might be various ways that folks take hormones or have, you know, gender confirmation surgeries, right? We know that with our kids, there, you know, there's additional like checks and balances that we do for minors to help them access things like hormones or various gender affirming surgeries. And then some people legally change their gender. So that means like updating their documents to have the gender marker that feels like it more closely aligns with them, or updating their legal name.
Can I jump in just with one comment about this? One thing I think that's important to note and is often confused is that the process of transitioning isn't linear. I have clients who really value changing their clothing style before they were to say grow out their hair, or work on changing the tone of their voice to be either higher or lower pitch. It doesn't mean that they're not trans. It means that they're experiencing it the way that they need to for their process. So it's unique to everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I had, so at 360, we have a housing program for LGBTQ youth who are experiencing homelessness, right? Because there's a disproportionate amount of youth who are homeless because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And so I had a transgender girl living with us, and she had started hormones, all this stuff, and was having such a hard time finding a job, like going to all these interviews in downtown Naperville. And then when she wasn't getting everything, she just came and like shaved her head and like threw the hormones in the trash can, and like was like, whatever, I'm just gonna have to be a boy. And then she went to a job interview and got hired like immediately. It was so heartbreaking. And she tried to be a boy and was like, nope, like, no, I know who I am. And then, eventually started. So like there's sometimes as much of like a welcoming like rainbow household I could make for her, the rest of the world sometimes isn't ready. And so that's one thing I'd say. Sometimes when our kids come out, our initial reaction isn't like confetti, right? Because we're also scared of like the world that we're sending them out into, and that's like totally real. As someone who is parenting 60 teens right now in our housing programs, like I still fear for the world. And so that's part of like why we are having this conversation tonight of like, how else do we like have more of a nest and a network so that our kids don't have those experiences, and that our young people, if they have questions, they might say, well, a kid in my class is transitioning, what does that mean? Like hopefully this conversation will help you be able to talk about that. And then so there's just a lot of terms, right? So I'm going to skip over some of these and talk a little bit about pronouns. And so pronouns is a conversation we hear a lot. You see in my name and Peggy's name that we put our pronouns in like the subject line under our box. And not really, again, a pronoun is just, how do I call you if I forget your name? So I say, she left her water bottle in my classroom. They left their water bottle in my classroom. He left his water bottle in my classroom. And so maybe you might have your child have a friend over and you're like, oh my gosh, is that a boy or girl? I don't know how to refer to that person. You can say to your child like, oh, your friend Taylor that came over, what are their pronouns? Like, and that's like a totally appropriate question to ask. And it's also even better if you say like, it might sound weird, but like, hi, I'm Mrs. Johnson. I use she, her pronouns. What's your name? What pronouns do you use? Like, it may depend like on your interaction with young people, but it's okay. You might say to your kid, like, what pronouns does your friend that was over use? And so again, this is, there's lots of different pronouns that people use. I'm seeing a trend where like teens might say, I use she and they pronouns. Either one feels good to me. You can call me she, you can call me they, them. And then there's this app, if you, or it's really a website, but if you search -18 pronoun app, you can like pick a pronoun and practice using it. And I found that that's nice, especially if like your kid's friend has been over as Jessica and she, her like all the time. And then now all of a sudden they're going by Jordan and you're like, oh gosh, I got to practice this in my brain. So wanted to share that. And then I'm going to skip some of these because I want us to get to being able to talk. So sorry, I'm skipping over these, but just want to share a little bit about what's happening in our schools right now. Some stats that we don't really take a lot of information around LGBTQ young people. So one of the first times that we did was in 2018. There's something called the Illinois Youth Survey that our 8th, 10th, and 12th graders get. And for the first time in 2018, we asked them, do you identify as male, female, transgender, or essentially non-binary, like not a boy, not a girl, something else. And about like 2% of our 12th graders identified as either trans or non-binary. Now, I wouldn't have asked the gender questions in this exact same way, because there might be someone who's like, well, yeah, I transitioned and now I'm a girl, like I don't need to answer the transgender piece. So this might even be underreported. And then we didn't get to do the IYS in 2020 because of COVID. But so we've never had data right around how many kids are trans in our schools. And I know that I'm focused a lot on trans kids. So we can also, if people have questions on like lesbian, gay, bisexual youth, feel free to ask. But you know, we used to think like 0.01% of people were trans. So this is a lot bigger. And so what does that mean for our schools that they're, I'm gonna skip, oh, sorry, I guess I didn't have that slide in there, but what does that mean for our schools is that they're having to try and figure out like, where do kids go to the bathrooms, locker rooms? So obviously those are big conversations. We have a lot of our middle schools that now have what are called GSAs, gender and sexuality alliances. So I think our schools are adapting, that they're having a lot more kids coming out. And then we had this LGBTQ curriculum bill that passed last year that went into effect July 1st. So now K through 12 schools are, you know, the spirit of the bill is that you're supposed to teach about the positive contributions of LGBTQ individuals in history. So we kind of, it's sort of focused on social studies, but it kind of gives schools that backbone to lean on, that it's okay to talk about LGBTQ people. It's okay to have, you know, books in your library that have, you know, Stella Brings a Family, which is about a little girl and her dad's on Mother's Day and like bringing them to the Mother's Day craft, you know, in elementary school. And so that's something that a lot of our schools, and, you know, if we're thinking about Downers Grove, are implementing this year, and then having to implement that over Zoom of like, how do we teach kids about some of these famous figures when we didn't learn about them ourselves? So our teachers are having to catch up as well. So that's a, you know, a very, very broad overview of kind of what's going on. And then I just wanted, before I get to the next question and we can go into Q&A, just share like some of the things like, okay, so we've learned about this, you're here on this presentation because you probably care about LGBTQ young people. So what do we do to create a welcoming environment? So some of the things that I might, you know, think about is like, from what I know of LGBTQ teens, they look for imagery and signs. So like, do we have rainbows up in our house, or, you know, in schools? That's, you know, one of the things I'm talking about. But, you know, this all are welcome here sign I have like on all of the offices at 360. And I have one, you know, I think in my window, you can see that back there. So that all my neighborhood kids walking by can see that. You know, thinking about like, okay, so my son is gay, like, can he have boys sleepover? Like, can he have girls sleepover? You know, like, what do sleepovers look like in our house? What books or movies are we showing to our kids? Like, you know, I don't know, asking them who they're following on TikTok. That will probably tell you a lot about their identities. And you know, especially I think if your kids are in like middle school, those heteronormative questions like, oh, do you have any crushes on any boys? Or like maybe you're just trying to like, do you have any crushes? Who knows if they'll tell you anyway, right? But so what are like some of the ways that we make them believe that we're going to assume that they're straight? So then is that building up a wall that they're not going to be able to feel comfortable with telling us who they are, kind of thing. So those are some of my, ideas, and I'd be interested to see what other folks are doing to create a welcoming home. But yeah, so I guess Peggy, what are you thinking right now? Any questions off the bat?
There is one question in the chat. For people who are not supportive of the trans community, one common objection that always comes up is sports. The common example given of female Olympians competing against trans women. They view it as an unfair advantage. How would a supporter of the trans community speak to this?
A great question. So right now we're seeing kind of targeted attacks of trans youth across the country. You can't even keep up with the amount of anti-trans bills there are in many states right now. And I think it was Mississippi who recently like passed it all the way through, and they're waiting for their governor to sign it. One of the things, so in Illinois, we're one of about 14 states that allows transgender kids to play on the sports team of their affirmed identity. So if your kids like identify as a boy, I want to play on the boys soccer team, you can do that. And so that's through like IHSA or IESA, the Illinois Elementary Sports Association. I think that's what that stands for. There's some paperwork that has to be filled out. But I talked to the executive director of the IHSA, and they only have about 10 trans kids a year applying. And usually only one of those is a transgender girl. So right now there's a lot of fear that there's going to be this competitive advantage. But if we look across all of these states that have bills, we're probably talking about 20 kids in the country, right? There's not a lot of trans girls playing sports, period, right? So there's a lot of conversation around that, something that's not really happening. And I think, so right, again, yeah, I think people have this in their mind. So the way, how do you speak up to that as a trans like ally is one, just like normalizing, we're not talking about thousands of kids here. It's like 1 or 2 kids per state that's trying to compete. Then I also try to remind people like, why do our kids play sports? And then obviously winning is great, but like what I remember from competing was that like the camaraderie, like time management, you have to learn how to like be a student and also like get your homework done. You have to like you're getting to exercise, like there's all these positive things that come out of sports, but like I think folks are focusing on like one thing of that. And then lastly, like just the competitive advantage that people think is happening from someone who they think of in a male body, really just like, I think studies have shown that it's not that kids aren't like way beyond the skill level compared to like a cisgender girl, right? Because they're not having a problem with a transgender boy playing soccer, right? They're having problems. It's like, I think we call it like trans misogyny, like afraid of trans women specifically, right? And that's the same thing that happens with locker rooms and bathrooms. So I don't really care if your transgender son wants to go in the boys' locker room, but I'm afraid if your transgender daughter goes in with my daughter, right? And so that's a lot of the conversations that we see. So I hope that helps, but I just kind of I also think that like if that's what someone's arguing, right, I don't know if I can change their mind, so I don't know how much energy I'm going to spend on that. But I just like to say like it really doesn't represent like the issue that I think a lot of the media makes it out to be. What else, Peggy?
I don't have any other questions right now. Does anybody have any questions that they want to put into the chat that we can talk more about?
And I can also, if you guys want to, I can go ahead and stop the recording here, and then we could open it up if people wanted to ask their own questions, but just be mindful of taking up too much time. I don't know if anyone wants to do that.
I do have another question. What's the difference between gay and queer?
That's a good question. So, like, it could be nothing, right? It could be like one person who uses the word gay could use the word queer and have the same definition. And so, right, if you're looking at like the basic definitions, I would say is like gay is like people who are attracted to people of the same gender as them. And then queer could mean that, or it could mean not fitting within the norms for gender or sexuality. Now, like I identify like as a queer person, gay feels fine to me, like lesbian is like okay, like there's words that sometimes feel like they fit a little bit better, but they're not wrong. So I think it just kind of depends. Queer can be political, and then I also like am conscious of like using the word queer in spaces that like some of my friends in different generations, like that was a really pejorative word used against them. And so hearing that word feels really uncomfortable versus someone else, it feels really empowering. Like I'm taking back that negative um, way that you use that and using it as my term of empowerment. So I think it just like depends on the person, what that word means to them.
Carolyn, I had one question that I wanted to visit that was submitted ahead of time. And the question was, how do we explain to our kids that although their friends and community are very accepting here, they will likely run into people who will not accept their lifestyle and possibly even people who would hurt them because of it?
I can jump in
Yeah.
and notes on that. I've worked with, typically when I see a trans kiddo, I also visit with parents at some point if they're minors, sometimes even if they're not, if they're over 18. I tend to be very straightforward about safety issues. It's not something that I feel like I have to introduce. It's something people are already concerned about. And so what I guess I would say is, I think that going back to what Carolyn mentioned earlier about building an environment of trust and being open is having those conversations about safety issues and kind of some of the ways that we can provide protection when we're out in the world and fearing different environments. I've had clients who, they want to go to the mall and they want to pass. Like passing is kind of, it's a big deal if you can, and passing means if you're a transgender woman, you go out into the world and people believe you are a woman, not a trans, like you're passing as a woman. So there's no indication that you've had any type of transition. And we talk about ways to stay safe. We talk about ways that they can sort of read environments so they're paying attention. It's kind of an unfortunate reality. I wish that I could sugarcoat it and say, you know what, you'll be fine. Like that's a more liberal city. You're going to be just fine. But the reality is there are people everywhere who have the feelings that they have. And so kind of also along the lines of what you said, Carolyn, about it's not something we can make go away overnight. And so I think that in some ways being prepared for that and learning ways to maintain safety is a really important tool.
Yeah, and I think, like LGBTQ folks, we have to advocate for ourselves like all the time, and you have to come out all the time, right? Or make that decision whether or not, I remember like taking my dog to like some vet and they're like, oh, is your husband gonna help pay for that or something? I don't know, and then you're like, do I need to say it to him that I don't have a husband? Like, do I need to come out to like the vet dentist or whatever? I think that's what it was, right? And so, but it's also like building some resiliency, because then you don't want your kid to be like, oh my gosh, they assumed I'm straight, like everything's terrible, right? So we have to we build a thick skin too. And reckon, one of the things that we talk about is like the world was created often as if LGBTQ people didn't exist, so we have to like change our laws. Yeah. You have to like go and apply for a name change. And if you're 18, you have to publish that in the newspaper. And that can feel really scary to put your private information out into the world. And so, our young people are constantly having to advocate for themselves. We don't necessarily want to be one of those barriers, but we don't want to, yeah, like you said, sugarcoat it that that's not going to happen. So I think I'm trying to think if there's anything else to that question, but just, the question I think is asking, like, how do we prepare our kids for that? In some ways, they've already experienced that, right? They've lived in a heterocentric, cis sexist world, right? All those words of like assumption that you're straight, assumption that you're not trans. So in some ways, like, we don't really have to tell them because they know they're living that. So more around like going what Peggy said is like, how do you safety plan? Like, how do you, if you think about our kids dating, how do they meet other LGBTQ youth, right? Is it at school? Are they going to be more likely to try out like apps or things like that? So not that you need to like be a helicopter over that, but those are things that I would be thinking about of like, how do I, give them experiences to be in community with other youth, so that they're not seeking that out in like a sneaky way online. So there's like tons of different support groups. So there's like Youth Outlook, which everything's online right now, but Youth Outlook does drop-in centers, safe space support group for LGBTQ youth. And then I have like tons of different ones that they can check into. Now that their transportation's not a barrier, you can get online. Youth Services of Glenview Northbrook has like an incredible program with lots of different for programming for youth. And then I was a part of creating this organization called Q Chat Space, which is a national organization, like drop-in center for youth to text, and it's like run by adults for kids to like connect with one another. So there's like a lot of ways I think that I would be focusing on like helping them build community, because they're going to have to do that throughout their lives.
You make a great point, Carolyn. I had a client tell me once, like, my mom's really worried about me going to the mall because she thinks if she says it out loud, I'll feel unsafe. And all I want her to know is I already know that people might want to hurt me.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things, like it is already out there. I mean, they see the news, they see social media, they see the attacks that are made on those folks. So it's kind of addressing the elephant that's already in the room. We do have a couple questions. One is a direct message and one was to everyone. Why don't I read the direct message first, and then Carolyn, you can read to everyone. How do you assure a teen that it's okay to be exploring and to not necessarily know how they identify as a particular label? What does it look like for them to be exploring, and how have you seen that process look in your practice?
That's a good question. I mean, I always think about, Peggy, you can talk about it, what you do in session, but I always like bring books. So like there's a great book called The ABCs of LGBT. Then there's like these little comics, which I'm not sure where they are in my house. I would go grab one, but it's like a quick guide to they, them pronouns. It's like a graphic novel, and there's a quick guide to queer and trans identities. So thinking about like bringing in books or media, I think is a way for them to like connect. But I'd be interested, Peggy, to see what you kind of do in session as people are figuring that out.
I've had a couple of clients who have been, and I'm talking more gender identity related, but clients who will come in and, we've been working together for 4 to 6 months, and they decide that they wanted to change their pronouns. And really, I think it all kind of starts from exactly what Carolyn said earlier. And this is a little redundant, but creating an environment where exploration is accepted and appreciated. Oh, I'm curious, how did you, was there an event that made that kind of changed your view of how you present or how you experience yourself? Or tell me more about how you made that change, or how you experienced that change, or so using language that's always open and affirming, and that lets them know that anything that they're choosing to share in their exploration is okay, that's part of what exploring means, and that's part of what the process looks like. We don't, there are many cultures throughout the world that don't have the boxes we have. I think it's also interesting to look at some of those things culturally, that what we've created as norms, in particular in the United States, are not the norms other countries subscribe to when it comes to gender expression. So I would even open up the conversation to broaden and look at other areas where we aren't in 2 boxes or 3 boxes.
Yeah.
And kind of inviting that into the conversation as well.
Like tangible things, it's like, what name do you want me to say at Starbucks, and they could put that on your cup, and you can see like what it's like to have that name on your cup for that day, like buying pride flags, or like having a painting night, let's paint our pride flag for our house, like what does our house pride flag look like. Other ways to explore. I mean, I can't tell you how excited our kids are when they get to go to a pride festival. And obviously COVID has impacted a lot, but we have so many things in the suburbs now. So like Aurora Pride, Naperville is having a Pride Fest September 11th and 12th this year, right? COVID dependent, but that was approved. Bolingbrook has a Pride picnic now. Mokina does. Like there's lots of events happening now. So you can pretty much hit something up throughout the summer without having to go to like Chicago Pride, which is a fun experience, but it's also overwhelming. And so I think those are some ways to explore. And then I think that kind of goes into the other question that someone wrote in the chat of just like, my child has come out to others, but not me yet. What are some ways to create an environment where she feels it's okay to talk to me? So I think that's like one of the hardest things, because you're like, what am I doing wrong that they're not telling me? And I think, so I would just encourage you, like, if that has been a thought of yours, like, don't let that sink in too deep, because sometimes, I skipped over a slide, but the Trevor Project, which is like a suicide prevention lifeline, asked young people who they were out to, and they were always out to their friends before their other peers. I can actually go back. Let me see if it has parents. No,
Yeah.
it's like their doctors, other classmates, their straight friends. Oh, no, parents right there. Sorry. So you can see who do you share your identity with? Most share with their peers, but it drops down to their parents. And so just like that's normal. I think sometimes it's just like awkward. I remember like being so nervous to ask my mom if I could shave my legs, right? Because it's just like, like, and that's not gender, right? Or sexual orientation, but like those things are sometimes just awkward to say. So I think, and one of the things I encourage is when someone comes out and they're like, I'm gay, and going, I know, I was waiting. That sometimes can be really, like, for some people that can be really affirming, and other people it's like, well, I was still figuring it out. How did you know? Like that, like, I'm so excited to finally know this, but then you're saying that all along. So I would, be careful about that. In terms of like trying to create a welcoming environment, I think it's just like, what are their media? I always come back to movies, media, what shows are you talking about? How are you talking about if there's LGBTQ legislation? Like, how is that discussed in your house? Is it in a positive light? And then,
Well, I think
some,
steering clear from assumptions, like,
yeah.
do you like any boys in your class? Like assuming that if you have a female child that she only likes boys, like having more neutral language around anything that could be possible.
Yeah. And I think the hardest part is like, if you do all these things, like eventually they will. Some people are like, I don't want to tell you until I'm dating somebody. That's just easier. But yeah, I think just, trying out some of these things, and then eventually, she'll share. But yeah, the waiting is hard.
I'm just going to point out that we really just have like a couple minutes left. So if anyone has any last questions, if you can post them in the chat, that would be great.
Peggy, I have a question for you.
Okay.
Right. So sometimes when our kids come out, like we think about all of like the rough stuff, right? But like, what is, like, talk about like some of the joy you've seen, like parenting an LGBTQ young person, of like, that your, families that you work with experience.
Well, so I've had, I am a cisgender female. I have 2 children of my own. I have a son and a daughter. In the clients I've worked with, a couple things. I worked with a young person a couple of years ago. They were coming to me. So if you're under 18 in the state of Illinois, you have to have a letter to do any type of hormone therapy to change your physical appearance, or surgically, either way. You get the benefit of informed consent when you're 18 or over, but under 18, you have to go to a therapist. And I always find that part of it kind of confusing, because I don't presume to be the expert on anybody who sits down with me. And so for me to write a letter stating that, yes, this is true, and this is what I've observed, seems sort of absurd, but that's part of the process. And I had a client, like I said, about 2 years ago, and we were in the process of starting hormones, or they were going to start hormones. And they had gone to school one day and had a moment where they experienced some real affirmation from some peers, and described it as gender euphoria, because they finally felt seen by others around them. And I gotta say, there's nothing better than being the person who gets to hear a child who has otherwise felt confused, invisible, lost, scared, alone, to feel like they're finally being seen for who they really are. The other thing I was going to say is, I've had parents who have had children who have had very significant, and this is kind of the negative, and I know you're wanting me to focus on the positive, but I'm getting there. Children who have had, really severe depression and anxiety, and have finally come out and have started the transition, and they feel like they've gotten their children back. Like real joy in the sense of they're knowing them again, because they're feeling affirmed and feeling like they're in the right body experience, gender expression.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of learning that has to take place, and there's some, real wrestling as parents, but I think that when they finally see that this is what their child is meant to be, there's just relief and joy, and just truly feeling accepted, I think.
Totally. Yeah. And I think one of the best things is like community, right? So sometimes when your child comes out, you feel like you're like, I'm the only one who, or I don't have, none of my friends have had a kid have XYZ identity, but there is so much community that happens. And so, um, there's like tons of parent groups that we can get you plugged in if you want to like have conversations like this more. But I mean, like the chosen family that I've built from like this work, from being a queer person, all that stuff, like I get my biological family plus this chosen family. And like, and so I think that's one of the best things. And sometimes, some of my young people are like, you teach people about all these negative statistics and what our outcomes could be, but like look at this joy and look at this community and this family and things that we've created. And so I always try and like center that in part of a conversation.
I think community is huge. I've referred so many people to your organization, Carolyn, and my families that have given me feedback have found a place of true belonging, where they feel heard and they feel like they have support.
Yeah, my one story, there was a question there, but I'll tell you really quickly. One of my favorite stories is, so I used to work at running this trans drop-in center on Wednesday nights, and I've never chosen to listen to Hamilton, but I could sing every single song too, just because like my kids would sing that to me every single night. And so I had this young person who's like obsessed with Hamilton, and like all I talked about for like a year was Hamilton, and he finally got to go to see Hamilton. And so then like the next week I'm like, how was Hamilton? Like, and he's like, you'll never believe this. I saw Hamilton. Then afterward, I really had to go to the bathroom, and I went to Subway, and I was like, hey, can I have the bathroom key? And they gave me the boys' bathroom key, and they saw me as a man and gave me that. And that was like, I was like, it just like really solidified, right, how like much this young person knows who they are. And like this like night that was supposed to be the best night of their life was like even better because of that. And so like that's like I'll carry that story with me for a really long time. as I'm like singing Hamilton to everybody. And so with our last like minute, maybe we'll answer this last question is, can you give a good response to non-supporters of the LGBTQ community who use religion and the Bible as an argument? And so I'll tell you, we've done like whole panels called like Healing the Rift about this. And I would like, if I'm going to give you like a short answer would be, if like that's someone's like perspective, like no one zinger, one line is really going to change someone's mind. And so I wish I could give you like a response, but I think like I might say, oh, you know, like I experienced the teaching of that religion to be different from what you're sharing with me, because you know, I hear about like loving people and caring for others, and that's kind of my takeaway, but I understand that like you're having a different interpretation. And like I don't believe in discarding people in my community, you know. And so again, like there's nothing I kind of get away from like, well, how do I disprove this verse, or how do I, you know, like, because that is really like, if someone's coming to me with that's what their perspective, like I'm not going to change that. So I'm trying to figure out where I invest my energy. And
I tend to go with, I stay away from the theology, and I'm not a particularly religious person. I tend to be more spiritual, but I've had comments like, you know, gosh, the God that I choose to believe in sees everybody and believes any of that is okay. Or the Jesus that I experienced in the religion I was brought up in, which happened to be Catholic, would never have turned away somebody who was, I mean, Mary Magdalene, like I would never, but I can't imagine Jesus would turn away this person or that person. And to your point, Carolyn, to be perfectly honest, the religion piece is so rooted for some people that I think my energy is better spent affirming in different ways than to try to tear down somebody else's faith beliefs, because it's just not going to go well for either one of us, really.
yeah. Awesome. Well,
Great. I'm going to go ahead and pull up how to contact you guys.
Real quick, one more question.
Oh,
Any tips or
yeah.
resources for parents wanting to learn more?
Can you say that again, Peggy?
Any good resources, books or resources for parents to learn more?
Okay, so my favorite book that I will give to any parent about trans kids is called The Transgender Teen, and it's by Brill. I think it's Stephanie Brill. And so it's like a purple cover. And I think that that's one of the best books. There's also a really cute book called This is a Book for Parents of Gay Kids or something.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds exactly what it is. And so I think that's a fun one to start with. And then I think I mentioned The ABCs of LGBT by Ashley Marsdell is one of my favorites as well.
Any other questions?
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. Carolyn and Peggy, I really appreciate you guys taking the time tonight. And we had a really nice attendance tonight. So I appreciate all of the parents who took the time tonight to come and learn. We will go ahead and share the slides that that Carolyn put up tonight with everyone who did register. So thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for coming.
Hey guys, I think it's just us here still.
We have one other person.
Oh, do we? Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
I corrected my typo. I'm gonna send this to you as a PDF that you could send out.
Okay. I can't tell if I'm still recording. This is terrible, but
You are, yeah.
am I still? Okay. Sorry, when I